There is, on Earth, just one frontier yet to explore. This barren, featureless desert is the seabed of the Atlantic Ocean. Its only inhabitants are fish that withstand the strong currents where icy Arctic water meets the Gulf Stream. When the monotony is broken, it's by the decaying remains of shipwrecks resting here 500 meters beneath storms that rage on the surface. And looming up, signs of exploration. Not by humans. No diver can survive at water depths this great. But metal frames are evidence of remotely controlled activity. For deep beneath the seabed, in a 150-million-year-old sandstone, lies oil. Bringing it ashore safely was to prove to be as tough and complex as space exploration, but with more twists and turns than anyone could have imagined. From here, the next land is Canada. This is the western coastline of the islands north of Scotland, looking out over the Atlantic Ocean. And 160 kilometres west of the Shetland Isles, beneath 500 metres of sea and 1,500 metres of seabed, a major oil field has been discovered. The first problem, what to call the find, or more precisely, how to pronounce it.
The commonly used term for pronunciation in the local area is Foinaven.
I pronounce the field Foinaven.
I think the proper pronunciation is Foinaven.
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 Well, we say Foinaven, but it should be Foinaven.
I don't know. Do you know?
What they did know was that they were building equipment for an oil field with conditions quite unlike any previously discovered around the British Isles, if not the world.
It's a very, very harsh area. Storms, cold, wind, snow, currents at various levels, seabed consistency of toothpaste at various points. It's a fairly tough place to be.
A tight schedule was planned to produce the first oil within 3.5 years, a third of the time it normally takes. It was a development that was going to push back the boundaries, and that meant it would be costly. So the faster it could be built, the quicker it would pay for itself. Across the world, construction yards were building separate parts of the same installations at the same time. Parallel engineering, it was called, and it meant work underway, even while the oil field was still being evaluated and equipment being designed. But it wasn't just engineering issues that had an effect on the project's development. In the winter of 1994, attention focused on the environment.
The environment being a real issue for Foinaven was right from the very start, because Foinaven came along at the time in the experience of Shetland, where the Brer oil tanker had gone aground near Sombra Head and had spilt about 80,000 tonnes of crude oil. So there was an extremely heightened awareness of environmental issues. There was a lot of concern that we were going to be downwind of Orkney and Shetland.
Eric Meek has been checking the beaches of the Orkney Islands for signs of oil spills for over 30 years. The proposal for such a big development gave him cause for concern.
Almost 1 million seabirds nest here during the summer months, many of them on the big sea cliffs which face west out towards the Atlantic frontier. And that's the first place that this oil could come ashore.
So it was against this background of short time scale, hostile weather conditions, unreachable water depths and environmental concerns that development of the new oil field began. At the centre of it all was to be a ship. Its design was based on Petrojarl 1, a Norwegian vessel that's been working in the North Sea for 10 years. She's used on oil fields that are too small to justify building a fixed platform. To ride out storms, she faces into the wind by swivelling around a central turret that's fixed to the seabed. And it's through the turret that pipes pass, carrying oil from oil wells on the seabed to the vessel's storage tanks. A floating production vessel was seen as the answer for Foinaven, not because the oil field was too small, but because the Atlantic water is too deep for a fixed platform. But for a new Petro-Jarl vessel to work in the Atlantic, she would need to be bigger. The solution lay in a Spanish shipyard. The Endeavour, a 6-year-old Russian submarine carrier. She was the right size and she was available. Work began to convert her. But continuing seismic surveys of the oil field led to a change of plan. At first it was believed there was enough oil to produce 50,000 barrels a day. Not insignificant, but modest compared with other new developments in areas less difficult to reach.
It started off with such pace, we did so much in such a short period of time in 1994 that it took a while to catch up, just to develop a really good understanding of what the reservoir was about.
But when the data had been fully interpreted, it suggested almost twice as much oil could be produced each day.
Seismic was telling us the field was bigger, and therefore we simply said, well, OK, let's go for it. Let's make her bigger and more useful.
Making it bigger turned conversion of the old submarine carrier into a gigantic jigsaw puzzle, somehow cutting out the middle of this 27,500-ton vessel and replacing it with a section large enough to accommodate the extra oil.
In the end, we had to build a new midship section, and we could just as well have built a new one.
By now, the first structures had taken shape, turned into manifolds and wellheads that would be installed on the seabed to control the flow of oil. Nothing like this had ever been built for the combination of extreme cold, current and depth. The first metal to be ready for installation was pipework. 6,000 metres of rigid pipe like this would be laid on the seabed, alongside 12,000 metres of control umbilical cables to bring the oil to the ship and return gas and water into the oil reservoir. Solid steel, each 10-metre section weighing 1.3 metric tons, and yet to transport it out into the Atlantic, rolled up like wire. Once out at sea, this would be rolled off these great spools and laid on the seabed, and await being connected up once the subsea equipment and ship arrived. This massive structure was not for the seabed, but for the ship. It was to become the base of the ship's turret. Through here, the riser pipes will eventually pass. But first it had to be lifted, all 1,200 metric tons of it, and sailed from its construction yard near Inverness to Spain, where it would be united with the ship. While the focus was on the turret, the old ship was being transformed. More than once she was eased in and out of the dry dock. Over 5 months she was to be cut into 3 sections and the middle one removed. Meanwhile, the insides were gutted, with the bow being turned into new accommodation and control areas, and the stern into new engine rooms.
Well, we're some 10 months after the project was sanctioned, and we're 70% complete, so that's quite an achievement.
As for the new enlarged mid-body section, with its vast oil storage tanks inside, it was built and sitting on the shipyard slipway, ready to take its place in the new ship. But first, it was to be launched. Greasing the slipway has eased the passage of ships into the sea from this construction yard for centuries. The Spanish Armada was built here and launched this way. But no armada ever looked like this. With the turret now in place on the deck, the mid-body was launched in June 1995.
All of a sudden, the mid-body section was produced, and before we knew where we were, the whole thing was being launched. And then you could think, well, yeah, this is actually going to happen. It's kind of like the realisation that that was the case.
With the stern of the vessel cut and separated from the bow, and the new mid-body section yet to be inserted, it was now all hands to bring it together to make it fit for 80 people to live and work in. At the same time, arriving from construction yards across Europe was equipment to power the vessel and to clean and process the oil. In Spanish weather that was to give a hint of what to expect in the North Atlantic, everything was brought on board, installed and connected. Within 11 months, the final transformation of the old submarine carrier, a new name.
The naming of this vessel signals the near completion of a daring undertaking.
I named the ship the Patriarch Foinaven.
Back in Britain, interest in the project was growing. Press tours took journalists round the yards where the subsea apparatus was being tested.
Basically, the Foinaven project is the interesting aspect. It's the first development in deep water west of Shetland, pioneering project. Water depth is 500, 600 metres. That implies that lots of new technology is going to be used.
Crucial among the new technologies were specially created systems to connect up equipment that would be installed on the seabed. The only way of finding out if they would work was to do dry runs. Under the sea, there could be no watchful eyes or guiding hands. To simulate the effect of being underwater, cranes supported the connecting tools, a job that only a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV, would be doing on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. But in a few months' time, all this would be happening underwater, operated from a ship being tossed by the sea, where the only eyes are a camera, and no last-minute adjustments to a tool can be made.
With a system as new as this and with so many new ideas that there are on this program, you would expect to have some sort of problems. Hopefully it's something that you can get around or work around at the time. We try and cover as many aspects as we can, but there may be something that catches us out. Hopefully not.
Back in Spain, the stage was set for the biggest event of the project.
I think the highlight of the project, obviously when we sailed away from Spain, that was a fantastic moment.
Sailing away to her position over the oil field west of Shetland, expectation was high. Technically, the obstacles in the ship seemed to have been overcome.
The last 2 years have been very challenging. We kicked off the project not knowing how we were going to clear some of the obstacles. We were breaking new ground.
But what no one knew was the challenging events yet to come. To start with, out in the bay, waiting for Patriarch Foinaven to emerge, was Environmental Action Group Greenpeace.
Where they were coming from was this is a pollution hazard, and we don't like what you're doing here, and basically we want to put a stop on exploring and developing oil. which is obviously in conflict with what we, BP, are doing and indeed what we need to do for the good of the country as well.
For the project, this was the opportunity to restate actions they'd been taking from the start.
Over the past 2 years, we've widely consulted with the Shetland Islands Council, with the Orkney Islands Council, with the environmental organisations who have an interest in this area, and we've taken on board the comments that they've made. We've listened carefully to what they've had to say, and where possible we've incorporated those comments in our design and the way that we've laid the development out.
They went to great efforts to explain to everybody, not just the council, but to the people of Orkney and to the various interests, the environmental interests and the other concerns, to demonstrate exactly what it was they were proposing to do and the measures they were proposing to take to ensure that the environment was not put at risk as a result of the operations.
I think that's actually one of the major success stories of Foinaven, is the way in which we listened, we learned, and we reacted. We did things that were different.
One outcome of the consultation process was the Grampian Frontier, the oil field's emergency standby vessel. At the request of the Orkney and Shetland island communities, this vessel was made powerful enough not just to support operations on Foinaven, but also to be capable of helping other shipping in the area. At the field itself, everything was ready for the vessel to arrive. The first pipework had been laid on the ocean floor almost a year earlier. Now, when the weather relented for long enough, the subsea equipment was painstakingly lowered to the seabed. Once in place, it was time to try out those land tests for real, connecting up the oil installations across an area the size of Glasgow. This was the part that everybody was excited about, the new technology, those specially devised tools in use for the first time, and the first time ROVs had been used for such complex operations. On the ship, there were pictures reminiscent of space probes, and the operations below were just as unreachable. Everything was so slow.
Yeah, Nick, we're just moving a stone there to get in position to dive. Not sure what the status of the sun is at the moment, but shouldn't be too long, I don't think.
So we can verify the location.
Picking up and connecting a single control cable could take up to 18 hours, and there were 40 to do. And then there were over 60 connections to connect the pipework to 23 wellheads.
From the video we can now see that the examiner is now attempting to duck into P14. The ROV's now moved over to R10, F32. Move back to the 10 milliliter mark. And the examiner's now located the tool fully in.
I think when the first time each particular tool worked, there was a great feeling of relief, not amazement. I think in our side, in the engineering side of the project, we knew it was all going to work.
It did. The innovative technology connected up all the equipment of the seabed successfully. Everything was ready to be switched on. Before oil was pumped through the system, a test with fluorescent dye, and that's when they discovered a problem. And it was a big one.
We were carrying out pressure tests, leak tests on the subsea system just to prove its integrity. And I remember hearing that we didn't have a system that was actually holding the pressure.
As we can see, there appears to be a leak.
This leak took a little while to actually determine where it was. And the very unfortunate thing was that we'd spent months actually connecting that manifold up.
Valve PV78 is approximately 50% closed, and there's still some dye coming from the nipple.
I can remember at the time feeling quite stressed and thinking, how are we going to resolve this problem? It almost seemed like the project was going to get shut down.
That failure on the manifold meant recovering the manifold, bring it back on shore, finding out what caused it.
Having the equipment installed on the seabed, it's a little bit like a moonshot. You can imagine trying to get the bits of the lunar lander back from the moon.
But if that was not problem enough, another one. Environmental activist Greenpeace turned from observational protest to direct action.
Greenpeace.
Over 2 weeks, operations were hampered, and it was some time before a compromise was reached.
Stena D to Captain Castle, please respond.
The outcomes of the discussions at the time is that Greenpeace agreed that they would not harass the Foinaven development anymore. They had basically made their point.
As for the technical problems, work continued to find the answers. The cause was the combination of the unique subsea conditions, but finding a solution was taking longer than anyone expected.
We were looking at a phenomenon that really nobody else had ever faced.
On the vessel, they continued to test the processing equipment while waiting for the oil to flow.
Well, we were very impatient to start producing, but we used the time as well as we could in testing the equipment, going through all sorts of exercises.
There were those, though, who viewed the delays as a positive sign.
I think within the community in Orkney, there was a certain relief that here was a company that was prepared to get things right before it got started. And the fact that they weren't satisfied with the way things were operating when they first tried to start production and were prepared to take the time to put it right, I think gave us a measure of confidence. There was a certain amusement, I have to say, as to whether the oil ever was actually going to arrive. But, the point was that when the oil came to Orkney, we wanted to be damn sure that it was coming in a tanker and not by itself.
We need the employment. There obviously were difficulties and problems to be overcome, but it came eventually and we were very glad to see it.
And see it they did. 37 months after the project began, the first shuttle tanker arrived to collect first oil and take it to the Flotte oil terminal on Orkney.
First oil. Fantastic moment to see that everything was finally working as it was intended to do.
We've just established a great reputation, a great track record, the ability to deal with problems, to solve them on the hoof, to get the job done and to get a great result at the end of it.
We've developed cameras, new toolings. We've had to come up with new concepts of how we fix things subsea. We've had to use new types of manipulators. We've done things that people won't never believe that we've done. And at the end of the day, we've come out learning an awful lot more, and also with a good, safe production system.
It's interesting that some other oil companies have had experienced similar problems since Foinaven. And one of the key things that we're doing is trying to make sure that the lessons learned get spread. It's the whole industry's learning from us.
Meanwhile, Foinaven is producing its target of around 100,000 barrels of oil a day, and the shuttle tankers are now a regular sight at the oil terminal on Orkney.
Every day you're reminded at how wonderful the scenery and the environment is in this area, and it really does bring home every single day the responsibilities we have here to run these operations in a very responsible manner and achieve very high levels of environmental performance.
And when the oil is used up, what will happen out in the field?
The vessel actually will go away and be used very successfully elsewhere. The manifolds on the seabed, well, we know we can get them back. We've had them back once already. The hardware can all be recovered. So we'll be leaving pristine environment behind us, and there'll be nothing to tell that we've actually been there.